who were born with a rare metabolic disorder, and each of them lived only 6 months.
What if the woman the world called unbreakable was only showing you half the story? What if the child standing beside a mother's public faith was quietly drowning in emotions she was never given permission to feel? And what if the silence that protected a family for decades was slowly destroying one of them from the inside? Stay with us, because what Nancy Guthrie's daughter has finally revealed will change everything you thought you understood about strength, grief, and the hidden cost of living inside someone else's story. For years, Nancy Guthrie was known as a woman of extraordinary faith. She spoke openly about grief, loss, and the painful, deeply personal work of trusting God through suffering that most people couldn't even imagine. 2 of her children were born with a rare metabolic disorder. Each of them lived only 6 months. And yet, somehow, Nancy stood before audiences, cameras, and grieving families around the world, offering words of hope that felt impossible given what she had endured. To millions of people, she became something more than a speaker or an author. She became a symbol, proof that faith could survive even the deepest heartbreak, proof that suffering could be redeemed, that pain, no matter how severe, could eventually be shaped into purpose. People leaned on her words. They shared her story. They pointed to her composure as evidence that belief could carry a person through the unthinkable. But here is what the world never asked. What was happening inside the home when the cameras were off? What was life truly like for the family members who didn't have a microphone, who didn't have an audience, and who never chose to make their grief a public testimony? Nancy Guthrie's daughter grew up in a household where grief wasn't a chapter in the past. It was the air they breathed every single day. While the public watched a mother stand in courage, a child was learning how to process emotions that had no clean name. Grief wasn't the heretical in that house. It was personal. It lived in conversations that stopped suddenly, in moments where joy felt complicated, in the quiet weight of a loss that never fully lifted. And growing up inside that grief came with an unspoken set of rules. She learned which questions not to ask. She learned which emotions to keep private. She learned that certain moments required composure instead of honesty. Not because anyone sat her down and told her those rules, but because silence teaches you things without saying a word. What made it heavier was the public dimension. Her mother's pain had become a source of inspiration for millions. Their family's tragedy had been packaged, shared, and transformed into a message of hope that reached across the world. And while Nancy Guthrie's daughter respected that deeply, it created an impossible tension inside her. How do you grieve messily when your family's suffering is already being held up as a model of faith? How do you admit to confusion, to anger, to doubt, when everyone around you has already decided what your story means? These were questions she carried silently, for years, with no clear answer and no safe place to ask them out loud. She has now admitted something that stopped people in their tracks. For years, she didn't feel allowed to struggle openly, not because her mother forbade it, but because the narrative surrounding their family left almost no room for unresolved, complicated emotions. Grief, when packaged as inspiration, can unintentionally silence the people still living inside it. She felt pressure to be grateful instead of honest, strong instead of confused, to represent faith instead of fear. And that pressure quietly shaped who she became. Every feeling came with a question. Is this okay to feel? Every reaction came with hesitation. Should I say this out loud? If sadness lingered too long, she wondered if something was wrong with her. If anger surfaced, she felt guilt for having it at all. Faith was present, but faith didn't erase the complexity of what she was carrying. What made it worse was the loneliness. She watched others speak freely about how her family's story had helped them heal. She heard strangers describe how Nancy's words had changed their lives. And while she was grateful for the impact, she was still privately trying to figure out how to grieve at her own pace, in her own way, without an audience. Friendships felt shallow sometimes, not because others lacked depth, but because she didn't know how to bring her full self into them. When people asked how she was doing, she gave safe answers. The honest ones felt too heavy to explain. Even joy felt complicated. Moments of happiness were followed by guilt. A sense that enjoying life too freely meant forgetting what had been lost. The most heartbreaking thing she shared was this. She didn't realize how much pain she was carrying until she finally stopped suppressing it. When she reached adulthood, the silence she relied on for years stopped protecting her. It began isolating her. Emotional exhaustion set in. Periods of numbness. Moments when the past surfaced without warning, without invitation, without any way to prepare. The weight she had learned to manage quietly was no longer manageable. And that was when she understood something she had never been told. Silence hadn't made her strong. It had made her alone. Breaking that pattern didn't happen quickly or cleanly. It took time. Took therapy. It took honest conversations she had avoided for years. It meant learning language for emotions she had never fully expressed. Allowing herself to feel anger without shame. Sadness without explanation. Doubt without the fear of disappointing anyone she loved. She has said that healing didn't come all at once. Came in permission. Permission to grieve differently. Permission to speak imperfectly. Permission to speak imperfectly. Permission to exist outside of a public narrative that had defined her family long before she had words for her own experience. And perhaps most importantly, permission to stop measuring her grief against her mother's faith and simply allow herself to be human. When Nancy Guthrie's daughter chose to break her silence, it wasn't because the pain was new. It was because carrying it silently had become heavier than the fear of being heard. And she was clear about something important. This was never about blame. She did not accuse her mother. She did not attempt to dismantle the legacy of faith their family had built through unimaginable suffering. She acknowledged the love. She acknowledged the intention. She acknowledged the faith that shaped their home and the courage it took for her mother to speak so openly about pain most people never experience. But she also acknowledged the cost. The cost of silence. The cost of growing up feeling invisible inside your own grief while the world celebrated the version of your family's story they were most comfortable with. She spoke about what it means to carry pain without permission to put it down. She spoke about the emotional self-monitoring that became second nature. She spoke about the loneliness of needing space to grieve differently when the world had already decided your family's grief looked a certain way. And in doing so, she gave language to something countless people quietly live with but rarely name. When Nancy Guthrie's daughter finally shared her truth, the reaction wasn't outrage. It was recognition. People weren't shocked because there was scandal. They were shaken because her words felt painfully, uncomfortably real. Adult children of public figures, of ministry leaders, of visible voices of faith quietly came forward to say, "I understand exactly what she means." They recognized the pressure to protect a parent's mission while suppressing personal struggle. They understood the feeling of wanting to honor a family's public faith while privately wondering where their own doubts were allowed to go. Her words resonated because they weren't dramatic. They were human, and they forced a question no one had thought to ask before. What happens to the people standing beside the public voice of hope? Nancy Guthrie's legacy of faith is not diminished by her daughter's honesty. If anything, it is deepened by it. Because now the world understands that grief inside a family doesn't move in one direction. It doesn't resolve neatly just because one person finds clarity. Pain spreads differently through every heart it touches. Her daughter's story doesn't contradict her mother's. Completes it. It fills in the spaces that public narratives always leave behind. The quiet corners where real people are still trying to find their footing long after the world has moved on. The world often prefers stories of clean redemption. Pain that transforms quickly into purpose. Pain that transforms quickly into purpose. Suffering that fits neatly into a lesson with a tidy ending. But Nancy Guthrie's daughter reminded everyone that healing is rarely tidy. It's uneven. It's slow. It's deeply personal. And it often happens years after the world has already moved on. What changed her wasn't the pain itself. It was recognizing that her voice mattered, even when it complicated the story others were comfortable with. Silence, she discovered, had never made her strong. Finding her voice did something silence never could. It gave her back to herself. And sometimes that is the most powerful testimony of all.